Good afternoon and welcome to ICE webinars. Today we are joined by Nicole Chief Strategist and Workforce Trainer, and Chuck Cox, Operational Excellence Consultant. ICE webinars would like to thank our sponsor, RSTI. Since 1985, RSTI has been training service engineers in the repair, maintenance and troubleshooting of diagnostic imaging equipment, which allows healthcare providers a cost-effective solution to servicing their medical imaging systems compared to OEM contracts. Training certificates received from attending RSTI classes are globally recognized. So for more information, please visit rsti-training.com. Now, just a quick reminder to save the date for our 2025 ICE Expo, which will take place at the Rosen Plaza Hotel in Orlando, Florida, February the 22nd to the 24th. The Imaging Conference and Expo is the only conference dedicated to imaging directors, radiology administrators, and imaging engineers. ICE offers valuable CE credits from the ASRT and ACI, and is a unique community of key decision makers and influential imaging professionals. For more details about that, please visit attendice.com. Okay, today's webinar, as usual, is eligible for one AIRT category A CE credit by the HRA. You can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey, which will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar. You must complete the survey to receive your one CE credit, and you'll be able to download the certificate directly from your computer once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. We'll be wrapping up today's presentation with a live Q&A, so please submit your questions anytime using the questions feature on the webinar dashboard. Okay, let's kick off today's webinar by giving away one of our ICE gym bags to the attendee that can tell me the answer to the following trivia question. August is National Eye Exam Month. What is the most common eye colour? Answer now using the questions feature on your dashboard, and I'll reveal the answer at the end of the webinar. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Nicole and Chuck are our presenters today, and they will be discussing ensuring MRI safety is no accident. So Nicole, you may begin whenever you're ready.
All right, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It is a pleasure to be here alongside my colleague Chuck, and a special thank you to RSTI for sponsoring today's event. Well, I am excited to get started on this. We know MR safety has been quite the buzz, and as a result of that, really making sure that we provide as much information as we can in order to at least help, our colleagues around us. And hold on a quick second here. So a little bit about me as we get started. A lot of you already know me in the imaging space. So I have been a director for about 15 years. I got my start in the military. And over the last maybe 7 years, I was really on this, safety train from my work in Guam and then coming back stateside, and really wanting to make a mark on sharing information, best practices, workforce training and development, all sorts of stuff to make sure that we're providing this information and having better outcomes for our patients. Over the last year or so, I have gone out and done more of the consulting role, and fortunately for me, found an excellent partner here, Chuck, who I'm delighted to meet you. It was like the perfect match, Chuck having over 50 years in quality, and then with my healthcare background, it was definitely a match made in heaven. So I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Chuck. Chuck?
Thank you, Nicole. Chuck Cox, I'm a master black belt. I've been teaching that at the University of Texas for the last 16 years. A consultant with a lot of experience around the world, basically in Europe, Asia. Over the past decades, I've been involved with several mission critical operations, from America's largest nuclear power plant to the initial design and building of America's first high volume airbag plant. That included not just the machinery, but also the design of the airbag itself. And as you know, there was a major competitor that went bankrupt because they didn't get it right. From the design of multiple medical devices to rocket motors and turbines for the aerospace industry, they all share a common denominator, and that is to thoroughly understand the various environments that you're likely to be operating in, and then apply methodologies that have been used repeatedly. None of this stuff is new, quite frankly, but it has to be adapted to your particular situation to come up with a safe, high quality, and high productivity state, and to have the ability to sustain that state. So key to doing that is the understanding of the entire system, to measure what matters for the system to routinely give you the expected outcomes, and to figure out how to use cheap data to avoid expensive events. Now, expensive events could be an accident. That's when things are negative. Expensive event could be no harm to patients or to staff, but it still could cause great deal of heartburn with respect to getting the MRI unit up and running again. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, and I look forward to answering people's questions as we go along or at the end.
And this is exactly why it was a match made in heaven, because after him hearing my heartburn as it pertains to operation and on a mission to help my colleagues solve this, we thought it would be a good idea to work together. So we've been working over the last 6+ months, developing all sorts of MR safety, healthcare safety, operational content for you all. So this is one of them we'd like to share. So with that said, you are here because MRI operations has been pretty challenging over the last couple of years. But let's take a pause and go back several years ago, starting with 1999 with the Institute of Healthcare to the report to Err is Human. You probably heard about this if you've been in healthcare for a bit. And this report was quite astounding, the results of it. They found that we had significant unnecessary harm plaguing our system. The report identified, hundreds and thousands of dollars being spent, and not to mention that over 100,000 of our patients dying each year unnecessary due to preventable medical errors. Now, upon hearing this, our entire healthcare system was really, gung-ho about making sure that these things got fixed. And for all of us as leaders, over the last several years, having several safety initiatives, from hand washing to infection to control, and of course to our MR safety. But one of the things that happened in the last several years, there was an updated report, the state of healthcare. Where are we now? Now, what would you think? For those of you who are in healthcare for several years, how would you feel from where you were 20+ years ago to where we are right now? Some of us are very hopeful, while others are like, gosh, there've been really not a whole lot of change. We've made some changes, but very incremental compared to our counterpart industries. You've heard Chuck talk about some of those industries, the airline industry, nuke, all of these high critical areas. How come that they have made significant strides compared to healthcare? And really, my opinion is that it is a bit bleak. Comparatively to the last 20 years, we are probably not in a whole lot better state than we are right now. And this report, 20 years later, showed that patient issues, safety issues can continue to plague our system. And this is very, very mind-boggling for us because we are putting in a lot of effort as leaders, as a healthcare industry. We are spending a lot of money regarding, making sure that we have good quality outcomes. But unfortunately, the spending isn't translating into better outcomes. Chuck?
One of the things we have is that the United States currently is spending about $12,000 per capita. We're the #1 spender in the world. #2 is Switzerland. They're 42% less expensive than us. What we spend, however, doesn't necessarily reflect itself in the results. We happen to be, with respect to infant mortality, we're 34th out of 38 countries that are members of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Community and Development. That's the beginning of life. Infant mortality, 34 out of 38. When it comes to end of life, longevity, we're 33 out of 38. So we're spending a heck of a lot of money, but our outcomes aren't necessarily first class. Oh, by the way, the second #2 out of 38 for longevity and infant mortality happens to be Switzerland. What are the Swiss doing differently than us? And for that matter, what are all the other so-called developed countries doing that's different than the American approach? They're spending 2/3 of their money in prevention, 1/3 in diagnosis and treatment. The exception to that is the United States. We're spending 1/3 in prevention and 2/3 in diagnosis and treatment. Now, if you happen to have 3rd or 4th stage cancer, you want to come to the United States because we have a lot of experience treating that. We don't catch it early, we deal with it late. But it's very much more expensive to deal with it late. So prevention, how do we get to being more prevention oriented? And I'll send it back to Nicole.
And this is one of the things too, and I can tell you along that journey, every time we're talking about some sort of initiative, typically the first bit of conversation is, do we have the money? Do we have the resources? Which is quite a stark difference, when I'm working with Asian counterparts or when I was working in Guam, that typically we didn't talk about money per se. And it seems to be that is one of the key concerns is, gosh, if we don't have money, we don't have the ability to change anything. And thus we're not necessarily able to move forward some of our safety initiatives. But even though we're spending a lot of money, and as Chuck said, we're not having that focus on preventative, and then of course the outcomes that we're seeing really doesn't match the other countries comparatively to the amount of spending. Now, when it comes to some of our concerns, they plague us, right? We have concerns as leaders, concerns as patients and staff. As I was researching some of the content for this presentation, here are some comments that I came about that ring through for all of us. The understaffing, depending on your operation or your organization, there's a lot of pressure that is put upon the staff to work at an unsafe speed. That is quite intriguing because, for you and I as leaders, that we're really trying our best to make sure that we create a safe environment. But this is what the perception is, that technically we as leaders collectively are making them work at this unsafe speed. And of course, we're having this blame culture where it is on the tech or whomever was involved in the incident versus having more systems thinking and applying just culture. There's a huge concern about their training. We get haphazard training, ad lib training, all sorts of stuff. And then the training, the quality of it these days, especially with the huge rotation of our travelers, people coming and going, we don't have that stability and consistency with the trainers. So this is some of the concerns where, in terms of the incident where the nurse got crushed with that bed, you saw the earlier picture, this is what people are saying. I would guarantee that the nurses are not trained properly. Too much to get done and not enough time. Definitely a stark reality with what is happening in our operation. People are saying the medical system is broken. Would you agree with that? Depending on where you work, some of us would feel, gosh, it is quite broken. I can tell you I've worked in a lot of broken organizations, but I come in with the absolute intent to help. But how broken it is, people describe it as like you feel like there's just these containers of gasoline being poured onto your operation. It is so chaotic and broken. How do you determine which gets the attention to be able to fix it? And then a lot of people are also saying these types of things that are happening, that is not a freak accident. These things are brewing in the background. And this again is the intent that Chuck and I came about with how do we make sure that we help others uncover pretty much the unknowns and the known knowns in the background that we're not necessarily paying attention to. So in the chat, I would like for you to tell me, how do you feel about managing MRI safety? We have a lot of you here today, and obviously there is some information that you're looking for to help you in your leadership. So, what is going on? There we go. What do you think about how is your MRI safety at the moment? Let's do this. In the chat there, how is managing your MR safety? Do you have a control of it? Ooh, Chandra, I like that. Real talk right there. It is scary, very, very scary. And for some of us, we think we got a handle on it. But to be honest, as a director coming into any department, my bum cheeks have been very, very clenched, thinking, oh my gosh, have I been attentive to everything? Was there something that I overlooked? Is my team actually executing? it does have a level of anxiety associated with it. So yeah, it is complex, we feel. I don't know what I don't know. This is new to me. I don't have a lot of experience in this area per se. I think I got a handle, but maybe there is something lurking in the background. It's acceptable, but room for improvement, says Cherry. Let's see. So these are actually how we feel about MR safety. A lot of us are experienced, even though if you've been in the field for 10, 15 years, you are experienced. But again, depending on the level of comfort and risk tolerance, there could be things lurking in the background. We have a lot of assumptions and expectations with the team as well. And this is what happened to me. I was fairly confident in MR safety. I follow Tobias, I read everything. I mean, I'm keeping up with my MR safety. But I've come into organizations, I understand what the needs are, the turnaround time, security, checklist, safety, training, all of these things. Yet, I found safety events happening under my watch. And this is exactly why we're here today. Because like me, you're wanting to enhance your safety conscious leadership. You recognize that it is scary. I am inexperienced. There are things that are probably lurking in my department that I'm unaware of. Maybe there's a lot of emphasis in one area versus the other. Maybe I'm expecting a lot from my team and I'm not necessarily getting that standardization and processes. There are deviations. So we want to, this is just an hour, so high level conversation on giving you some insights on how to make your operation safer with the intent of bringing no harm to patients. And this is where we're trying to get to the theoretical zero concept of patient safety, where we can actually strive to get to theoretical zero of preventable and unnecessary harm. And this is where I told you my journey in patient safety came. I didn't want to be responsible for the department that did not send a patient home to their loved ones, to their furry friends. So I wanted to make sure that I was crossing as many T's and dotting many I's. However, I also recognize that this is very, very surface level, and there's so much for us to learn and really execute given limited resources. And recognizing that I can't afford to do things that I was doing for the last 15 years of my career in along different operations. I had to put on a new lens, a quality lens, an operational excellence lens. But, we have a lot of problems plaguing our organizations, and this is where it becomes very sticky for us. Chuck?
Yeah, one of the things we see over and over and again is that when there is an incident or an event that actually turns into an accident that has negative consequences, it's usually not just one thing that happened. It's usually 2 things, 3 things. There's a series of events that each one of which had a very small risk of occurring, but they did occur, and because of that, now we're in a problem. And so what we want to do is we want to understand each of our processes and understand what is normal and what is not, and understand what is the limitations of the variability. You're always going to have variability, there's no question about that. How much variability is tolerable, and you'll never get into trouble as long as you stay within those guardrails. So once we get beyond those guardrails, however, very often our operations are not well defined, and so we don't know how far beyond we can go before we get into a potential problem. So the consequence, deviations are discounted to the point where we normally think, well, yeah, that's not exactly what we would have expected, but we got through the day. And what we really need to be doing is to work on understanding our processes so well that we can understand clearly what is the variability and the variability we can tolerate versus the variability we cannot. There's no way that we're going to get to absolutely the exact same thing all the time. So sometimes we put too much in the way of resources into getting our variability down to shrink it down to very, very small. And very often we don't know that that's what we should be doing. Very often we're spending resources when we don't need to spend resources. So characterizing our processes and characterizing them well, not only does it enhance our safety, you'll be surprised. You get a twofer or a threefer, because really understanding what your process is almost always, in my instance, it's 99% of the time, improves your productivity. At the same time, the safety is going up, and it improves your quality. So understanding the environment you operate in, and then the processes and how the processes talk to each other. Next. You have an understanding of what's to be expected of this process as it works on this patient, taking this kind of an image with the patient in this position. And so we, at the end of the day, have come up with a way of understanding how much risk we have and how can we measure so that we know that we've got this under control. And because we're measuring on a routine basis, we can see trends. We can see when we're trending and towards problems, but we're not there yet. And now we can make adjustments. Before we get into trouble, we make adjustments. So it's this risk tolerance and management issue that's really important, but you cannot get to that level until you begin to understand deviations and how much variability can you tolerate. Nicole.
Now, one of the biggest problems that we see are this focus on reactive metrics. This is a very downstream approach, and we'll talk about that in a second here. So I want you to think about what are some of the metrics that you're using right now, and maybe if you can put some abbreviations in the chat. And we're going to dissect that a bit, and how does that really contribute to safety? As you're typing that, let me tell you some of the ones I have used in my operation. Turnaround time, we got to look at that productivity, right? The CFO is really hammering down that productivity in each department and asking for an explanation of why I hit under 88% typically. The checklists, are the checklists completed? The number of completed checklists along with the date and signature. Number of burns that patients have experienced, number of ferrous objects that have entered the MR unit, and of course those near misses, depending on some organizations. I have actually tracked near misses from the techs. Competency completions, oh gosh, at the end of the year, September, have we completed competencies, and making sure we're just not checking the box as we're completing them. MR training, how many people are getting level 1 and level 2 training, as well as MR vacancy, how long it's been taking us to fill some of these positions. So when we think about these type of metrics, they are very reactive. We only find out about events later on. It doesn't give us any understanding of those processes and what is happening, as Chuck was just saying. So think about yours for a second. How well is that helping you with really being proactive on safety? For most of the times, if you were like me, I've had patients with pacemakers that should not have been scanned. I've had a wheelchair enter the room, IV pole, and a buffer. These are all ticking time bombs. Even though I had a list of all of these checklists and great metrics, I really didn't understand what was lurking in the background. I had relative confidence. My team was a strong team, but still we ended up with these issues. And they were quite significant and unfortunately led to some employees being terminated, which, we won't get into, but unfortunately, some of us, there needs to be a scapegoat at some times. Let's be real about it. We say just culture, but not every organization is using just culture. But unfortunately, even though you could be like myself, being very confident in your operation, these things can happen even with a stellar team. And unfortunately, like I said, when do we know about the incident? Later. Even though we're having all of these great metrics, we find out about this information. So these are the ticking time bombs that are lurking within our operation. And those incidents can certainly lead to some significant accidents that we've seen recently. Chuck?
So the problem we have is to isolate the variability that we normally see. When does it become too much. So we have an event, which may be an incident. And if the incident has negative consequences, it's an accident. We'd like to understand our automatic variability in this particular process so well that we can actually predict when things are going to start being high risk and avoid the high risk by making adjustments. So, as I said before, it's very, very rare that you have just one thing go wrong. You have one thing go wrong, and that sets the stage for the second thing going wrong, and that sets the stage for the big event that can be proven very costly and maybe even turns into an accident with a patient being either killed or maimed. And so the way we can get to the base of this is to stop the first thing from going wrong. That's the issue here. Go ahead.
So then how do you measure right now, or what is it that you're currently measuring in your operations? Some of the similar metrics like me? Well, maybe this is now the time to reconsider that. So if we can spend maybe about a minute or so, you sharing with us in the chat, what are some of the metrics that you are currently tracking related to your MR operations? And let's look at that to see really how do they support being proactive to reduce some of these accidents. In my case, how did turnaround time really helped me to be proactive about preventing that IV pull? Even though we had processes in place, there were definitely gaps, as Chuck was saying, these accidents happen in three. The things, what the Swiss cheese model, how many opportunities there are for things to go through the cracks. So I definitely want all of you to spend some time dissecting your metrics and asking yourself, is this actually helping me prevent safety? Now, it gives us good understanding at the end. It helps us to do a root cause analysis and really get some good information. But we don't want to do that when somebody's been hurt or maimed. We don't want that when a weapon has entered the scanner. So we want now to rethink these reactive metrics and focus on a little bit of a different approach, which we'll share with you. Now, Chuck, tell us a little bit about why we need to be rethinking these reactive metrics as they come in the chat.
Well, one of the problems with reactive metrics is we have a tremendous amount of effort that, and usually it's very high, very, very costly to deal with these things after you've had a negative event. So what we'd like to do is to be measuring things that are really of consequence as early in the process as possible, so we can identify a problem very early before it becomes an event. And to the extent that we've got the data and are looking at analyzing the data, it will show you. The data will start to talk to you if you analyze it. It will talk to you about, hey, you had a near miss here. You might not even have known you had a near miss. But if you've got the right metrics in place and you're continually understanding what the metrics are telling you with respect to your operations at that particular time when that particular data set was taken, now you have a surrogate for your operation. You can even get to the point where you can simulate your operation. So the opportunities for improvement are there at the same time as you're looking for opportunities that could have resulted in a negative event.
One thing to consider too, Richard, you're right on top of it there with auditing prior images being reviewed before the patient enters zone 4. And that's exactly what we're talking about, right? What can you do? What is that point that you don't want anything bad to happen after that? So you characterize your processes, as we said. So for example, even thinking about your equipment, we're measuring temperature, we're measuring humidity, there is a threshold. If this, what do we do? Who do we call? Do we stop scanning? Do we get the engineer on site, etc.? So it's the same thing that we need to really look at when it comes to patient care. From an MRSO standpoint, operational, we're looking at either the clinical aspect or the operational aspect, kind of in two different silos, but we really need to bridge these together. So this is why we're saying we need to rethink our reactive KPIs because of the customer impact. Chuck?
Yeah, one of the things we all know that there's certain devices that may be implanted. There might be a heart pacemaker, and the serial number on the heart pacemaker will tell you what series it is part of and what are the things that you need to do to deal with that particular pacemaker. Some pacemakers, the really old ones, had basically you could not do MRIs. So, but the later ones have abilities that basically the pacemaker people have begun to understand this. So why not have a serial number on a piece of paper related to that patient that is sent over a day or so before the actual patient shows up, and you can understand, is this pacemaker on the do not MRI list, or is it possible? And also understand when that thing was installed, because pacemakers can be taken off and replaced. So you need to have a date, another piece of data, a serial number, another piece of data. You need to know who's scheduled and what is the person that's going to be there, who's the expert on pacemakers. How do you schedule them? Again, we're talking about data. How do you get them to be there just at the moment in time when you need them and not waste their time waiting around, and free them up to go back to their other duties? So you've got an awful lot of different pieces of data. And if you get a system in place, all of this data can be coordinated. So it really is quite inexpensive. And by the way, an awful lot of this data you're already collecting. You already have it in various and sundry places. It's just that you're not analyzing it to use for your purposes. It may be data, the temperature and humidity, for example, are excellent things that you have to have from day one with MRI operations. But is there a possibility you could analyze that data to understand, here in the Phoenix area, we are now getting world-class heat. And what's the example of what happens in an MRI clinic if the outdoor heat gets above this level? In many instances, we don't know. And I don't think that we're necessarily prepared. So, and what's the impact on the patient? So all of this stuff can be analyzed with the data system. In many instances, we already have in place. Are we aware of that? And can we stop this craziness of analyzing the living daylights out of an event after the fact and go upstream in the process and understand the relationship between inside the process at the moment in time something is happening versus at the very end of the process when the outcome didn't turn out the exact way we wanted it to?
Go ahead,
So
Chuck.
that means going upstream. Upstream. We want to move from the reactive to the proactive. Go ahead, Nicole. So we want to analyze your system, and it is your system. All of the MRIs are somewhat similar, but your system is unique. How is your system different than others? So we want to know the variation in the environment that your system sees. Do you have a lot of pediatric, or do you have a lot of elderly? Do you have a lot of this or a lot of that? Your patient population is going to be different. It may be even different given the time of year. Here in Phoenix, we have a lot of people come down here in the wintertime. So we have these snowbirds who constitute a fairly large chunk of our medical population in the winter, but we don't see them in the summer. So have you analyzed what is the population that's going through your MRI? Are you prepared for the surge of elderly that happened in November and December? Are you prepared for certain kind of events happening in the environment? We have situations where we have these huge fires, and what are the outcomes of the personnel that have survived those fires? So I can't tell you what it is to look for. All I can tell you is to go look. Understand what your data is telling you, because if you don't, you're going to be in for surprises. And almost always surprises cost a lot of money. They cause a lot of harm. We want to be proactive with respect to the patient. For example, the serial number on that person's heart pacemaker. We want to be proactive with respect to the image request, especially if there's been previous images, as Nicole was talking about. We want to be very proactive with respect to the staff. If there's a staff shortage and we can see it, or there's a series of people that are going to take vacation, how do we adjust our schedules? We can do that. And you know, adjusting the schedule of a production operation in a manufacturing plant is nothing compared to adjusting the schedule, but we've got the technology for doing an almost instantaneous scheduling adjustment today. 20 years ago, we could schedule production plants, but we couldn't schedule people. Now we've got that. The processes, truly understand what our process needs to act at its highest productive state. And oh, by the way, I've never run across a highest productive state that wasn't also the highest safety state. If you go in looking for one, you're going to find the other, but you got to be looking. And then the facilities, a lot of people ignore the facilities issue. They're the support, and how do we know that they're operating at their level to support you as you go forward? Are there some technologies that they could be using? So the very first thing is to surface the known and then drive down to the unknowns. We want to clearly understand what constitutes stable, what a level of variability is tolerable. We want to know what we can control and what's not controllable. So we've got to monitor it so we can make a decision fairly quickly. If it starts to go bad on us, that would be like the outside temperatures around the clinic. Next. What are the linkages between different processes? We're taking a systems approach, a holistic approach. We need to know, how do the systems communicate with each other? And most important, we need to know what things are the drivers. What things are driving our operation today, this month, in the long term. We need extremely short-term drivers and medium-term and long-term drivers. And what things do we need to measure versus what things do we not? Because measurement systems today are extremely cheap. People wind up measuring a lot of stuff that they never use. So stop focusing on 3 things when you can focus on 1. Or more likely, stop focusing on 20 things when you can focus on 6, and those 6 will keep you out of trouble forever. So once you get involved in the proactive, moving from the reactive upstream to proactive, there's going to be some realization, oh my God, there's 2 or 3 things that we could use a predictive approach on, even before the patient shows up, even before we do the startup for this business day. There are things that we can be measuring that will predict how well the day is going to go. And here's the classic graphic that shows all of these things in one spot. So you've got the 4 steps with the key input. At the very end, the reactive metrics, we would like you to start thinking more about going upstream, having the ability to feed back from your reactive metrics into, like for instance, this one, from the reactive metrics of step 2. But we also want to feed back from step 3 upwards to step 1. And predictive metrics can be feeding forward to tell step 1 what it's got coming at it, or it may be that step 1 is going to feed forward to step 3. But only understanding your processes and how they link together and talk with each other, communicate with each other. Once you've decided this one is really important, now you have to start saying, okay, we're going to follow this one and see what it tells us And what is it? We're going to write an SOP that says if we have exceeded this particular step at this level, at this temperature, at this time frame, whatever, we're going to make an adjustment. So accurate, timely decision making with feedback and feed forward loops. And you say, oh my God, this is an awful lot of book work. When you start doing it, the first time you do it, it is. But once you get it inside the system and it becomes the way we do business, all kinds of stress goes away because you've got a control system in place. Next. Obviously, prevention is better than the cure. This is another great graphic. If we're at the reactive mode right now, and we're mostly 70% reactive and 30% on proactive, how about we move to being proactive and look, predictive, of course, is 0 at this juncture, but let's move to a world where we've got maybe 30% of our KPIs are reactive, and we dominate our operation with 60% of our measures being proactive, and we're starting to experiment with predictive analysis, so we have 10% there. That's the place where you want to be starting to move to. Going upstream. Upstream is where you can understand your process the best, the earliest, with the greatest amount of control of what your outcomes are going to be.
So what do we do next? Well, obviously, we've seen that sometimes our current methodology may not really get us to the level of safety that we want. So just like in my case, you're focusing on a lot of those reactive metrics, waiting for something to happen, and then deep dive into it. So really going back and paying attention to your processes. So let's look at some of these strategies that would enhance safety within your operations. Chuck?
The first thing is, we really want to understand the mission critical aspects. We want to identify those things that happen with a very low frequency, but when they happen, they are a total disaster. And we can learn a lot from the existing accidents, but that's not the primary source. In the short run, it'll be the primary source, but in the long term, we want to create the competencies that allow us to gather this critical information and to define it so that regular staff people, not technicians, not people that are engineers, not people that have got 7 or 8 or 10 years of working in a scientific lab, just ordinary run-of-the-mill staff people that are interfacing with patients every day, what do they need so that they can understand the process and what needs to be done to make adjustments in a timely basis. Walk your process to identify deviations and deficiencies which are happening right now as we speak. And that's not going to get the underlying ones. We'll get those later. And then educate your patients, the staff, and ancillaries. That means the facilities people. That means the people that are responsible for supplying oxygen in the case the patient needs oxygen. All of those kinds of activities. Systems approach means everybody gets involved, everybody gets looked at. Some, of course, have very, very high risk, others not so much. And then assess, identify your mission critical pieces. Go forth and mistake-proof things. It's impossible to put diesel fuel into a gas car. Why? Because the filler things are completely different. You can't get there from here, okay? That's called mistake-proofing. And there's ways of mistake-proofing your operations too. Many of them have already been put in place by some of the leading ones, but you can get involved in doing this, and I urge you to get involved in doing mistake-proofing.
The other aspect too is rethinking our approach to training. Again, we take this for granted, right? You have a tech who's been doing it for years, but not because grandma has been driving for 40 years means she's good at it or she's consistent at how she's driving. And that same concept comes in with our training. We have a lot of expectations and assumptions in our team, and we have that level of confidence that they're doing it right. So just as we were talking about, walk your processes and identifying those deviations. I know when I started Gemba walking my operation, boy, oh boy, were there a lot of deviations from what I thought was standard within my operations. So let's look at sometimes how training can occur within our environment. We think we know what we're doing, right? I've been in tech for so many years, and somebody comes and say, listen, no, this is how you should do it. But they don't necessarily show us what the expectations are. So it's left to us to pretty much understand or interpret that on our own. We go about thinking we're doing it right until we can potentially get in trouble. Maybe the person who is sharing, their interpretation of what that training is quite different from your expectations as the imaging leader. So key to make sure, again, that standardization, the key aspects, the mission critical aspects of your operation, are they being trained significantly? And coming back to with the competencies, sure, could you do an MR head, an MRA? Are you able to help with sedation, transfer of patients, all of this? But where are the competencies for those low frequency but high risk items? Where is the training associated with it? It needs to be at the forefront of their minds. Chuck?
So I think everybody on the webinar will be aware of this guy, Sully. He was a pilot with U.S. Airways, and he took off from LaGuardia and had the unfortunate happening of going into a cluster of birds that killed both of his engines. And 40 years experienced pilot, you can bet that he never ever had a simulation event like this. But he was still able to land the aircraft in the Hudson River, and everybody was able to escape from that particular accident. The question you have to ask yourself is, how many Sullys do you have in your operation? How many people do you have that know everything or almost everything? And the answer is, you're darn lucky to have one. So how do you get the knowledge of that one person to be at the fingertips of all the other people in the operation? That's critical, and training is a big chunk of that. But training aids and day-to-day operational aids, and I can't tell you what, I mean, there's a gazillion of them that are possible. And even to the point where some people are more amenable to using some kind of aids than others are to using the same aids. So I would urge you, MRI operations, sure, you've got a very expensive asset, but you've got that asset is absolutely useless without well-trained people that understand what is the process and are able to operate that process on a very safe, but also almost always very high productivity. That they are not in conflict. Some people think if you're high productivity, you're unsafe, or if you're very safe, you're low productivity. My experience has been that's not the case. You can be both. In fact, I dare you to come up with high productivity without safety. I dare you to come up with high safety without high productivity. So how you do that is based on how the staff understands the process and how they're trained. And I got to tell you, the infrequent things that really cause an unbelievable negative event, those things are so infrequent that almost always people do not remember, or they misremember that piece of the training. So you've got to figure out ways for them to get trained up on the things that are very unlikely to happen, but when they do, they are disastrous, and as well as the routine stuff. How do you do that? Different organizations have done it different ways, but you have to address that issue. That's the most important issue. What are the knowledge aids you're going to put in place for your staff to maintain a certain level of knowledge at each one of the steps in your process? You want to move to being proactive. You want to go upstream as far as you possibly can. You want to have an inexpensive, easy way of gathering data and a very, very easy approach to analyzing the data so you can react to it on a timely basis. and there's all kinds of clever things you can do there. Go on.
All right, so again, this is a very high-level introduction of giving you insights and how you can think differently about your approach to operations, intersecting the clinical and the actual administrative part of it. And in my 20 years, we've been very, very focused on the reactive, the outcome, waiting for something to happen, with less emphasis on that upstream approach. And as a reminder, it is easier and cheaper to avoid breaking things than to clean up the mess afterwards. Wouldn't you agree with that, Chuck?
Absolutely. The data systems we have available to us now are just dirt cheap. Using dirt cheap data to avoid very expensive events, I mean, that's a no-brainer. And that's where this movement from being reactive to being proactive, to even to the extent we can be predictive, that's why it makes solid business sense. Your CFO will love it, but you're going to love it because you have a lot less stress, because you've got a well-defined process. You know what you have to do to keep it well-defined and well operating and safe. Safe will absolutely be an outcome associated with high productivity and high quality.
All right, so with that said, this is a long journey. As we've seen from the Institute of Health report to Air is Human, even 20 years later, we are still having this concern of the amount of unsafe events happening, the amount of unnecessary harm. So we ask all of you to together, let's be the pillar of change to reduce this unnecessary harm. And while this is a human-run operation, perfection is not necessarily attainable, but definitely if we chase perfection, we can catch that excellence. So we have quite a bit more coming up for you. If you're interested in learning about more of these concepts in a more deep dive level, really introducing the quality operational excellence, you can definitely scan that QR code and let us know your interest. There is our contact information too if you want to deep dive into these concepts a bit more, understanding the type of proactive metrics that you could implement to ensure those errors as they happen in threes, that they don't lead to a sentinel event. And with that said, I appreciate your time and attendance today to help make this industry a safer community for our patients and our staff. And I'll turn it over to you, Linda, for questions.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Nicole. Got a couple of questions come in. The first one is, what approach is used to decompose operations and determine where the highest risks are?
Chuck, I'll have you answer that.
The typical approach is one that industries across the world have been avoiding, in my experience anyway. The classic one that I'm very much in favor of is the FMEA 5th edition that came out in June of 2019. So it's 5 years old, and the number of organizations outside of people who are mission critical that should be using it and don't, it's a very long list. But the automotive industry in the United States and the automotive industry in Germany in 2019 put out a harmonized FMEA, and it went from a 3-step process to a 7-step process. And one of those steps is structure, and how you deal with the structure. That's the essence of how you break apart a system.
Perfect. And another question that's popped up is, do the most significant risks come from the routine stuff or from the special variation or unusual variation stuff?
We typically see that it is things that were not accounted for that cause the worst accidents. Now, you have very small amounts of variation that are not accounted for, and they have what I call nuisance incidents. And nuisance incidents occur when you are ignoring trends, when you're not utilizing the analysis of your data to keep you out of trouble on a routine basis. But the nuisance incidents are quite frequent, and people have workarounds for them, and sometimes they even have workarounds against the workarounds. And you just sit there and scratch your head. Why don't you just solve the problem at its root and be done with it, but that's not necessarily how people think. So, and there's culture too. Sometimes there's leadership that says, you guys are in control of your system, and I expect you to learn from your system, and I expect you to improve your system on an ongoing basis. That's one culture. There's another culture is you will do as I say, and whatever the SOPs we've got in place, and you will follow those to the letter, and I don't want to hear anything else from you. Those are the two ends of the spectrum. So I advocate for the fact that even if you had a perfect system 5 years ago, the system is not perfect today, and it will have changed. And are the people in the system having the ability to make the changes necessary to fix things as they go along? And most importantly, we see all kinds of new technology that if the people are aware of the technology and they have the ability to internally leverage that technology, they can dramatically improve a process that may not be all that great, and they can make it great. So I'm not sure I've answered the question, but I've given it a shot.
I'd like to expand on that culture as well. So in one of my organizations, we recognize that the OR staff, when they're coming to do that deep sedation, they had access to the suite. And I was like, nope, we're going to shut this down. We're going to make sure that we are being very protective of who has access. Well, my goodness, let me tell you, people came and they were banging down that door when they recognized that they didn't have access. Now, granted, my communication slipped a bit. I told everybody but this one small group of doctors, and came stomping into my office. This is ridiculous. I need access. I've been doing this for how many years? You can't do this. As opposed to, okay, let's understand why. Let's make sure that if you have to have access, what type of training, what is the actual, are you going into zone 4? Who are you going to be there with? Making sure that, again, safety is at the forefront. And I can tell you, maybe in my younger days, if that physician had approached me like that, more than likely I would have been like, okay, you know what, let's give him access, as opposed to really standing firm on that. No, this is in the best interest of the department. Here is why. You are coming in and out of MRI on a sometimes frequent basis, but safety is not at the forefront of your mind like my technologists are, right? They're making sure everybody is pat down. They're guarding that door appropriately. You're coming in with a focus on the patient. So you're not necessarily thinking, do I have metal? What is it that could potentially go into the scanner that shouldn't? So the culture is sometimes very, very difficult to break through. I see Christina here as an MRSO. Even for me to get an MRSO and convincing, persuading my senior leadership of why this is needed, they just saw it as an additional person rather than all of these unknowns that we really need to have very good processes, making sure that we have one person who could be accountable for reviewing information versus this haphazard, scattered approach. Nicole starts with it on her shift, then it goes to Chuck. Chuck is going back and doing some information, but then he goes off sick for a couple of days. Somebody comes after, and they're just kind of piecemealing things like that. So there was definitely a lot of opportunity for things to slip through the cracks. And then the other aspect on change is, we again have that confidence, and granted, I've had stellar teams, some of them needing a little bit more training and improvement in competencies, but we expect that because we have been good for the last 15 plus years, that means that we're going to be good for the next how many years. And that, if we become complacent, can get us in trouble. Our systems are dynamically changing. It is organic. This is not a static system, right? We have new people coming and going. People get complacent. Again, they are tolerating a little bit more risk. The workaround, we're moving faster. There's a lot of perceived pressures on us. So we have to be very, very cautious, not taking it for granted that because we've had this stability and this great track record means we're going to have that into the future.
Perfect. We've come up to the hour now. So thank you so much, Nicole and Chuck, for your time today and for a great presentation. Also, thank you to our sponsor, RSTI. So please visit their website, rsti-training.com, for more details of their training programs. As promised, the answer to today's trivia question is brown. So congratulations to our winner, Suzanne Dodson in Ohio. Just a quick reminder, you can obtain your CE certificate by completing the post-webinar survey, which will be emailed 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar. You must complete the survey to receive your 1 Art Category A CE credit by the HRA, and you'll be able to download the certificate directly from your computer once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, you can reach us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. Please visit icewebinars.live for more details of all our upcoming ICE webinars and, of course, complimentary registration. Now, if you've missed any of our past ICE webinars, including any by Nicole, please visit icewebinars.live to view our whole webinar archive. So thank you once again for your time today, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks again, Linda. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Linda.